Hi, everyone. Welcome to part one of the 60s and Vietnam. Our question to think about here, how does the Kennedy administration embody the spirit of the hope and promise of the early 1960s? We already know the outcome of the 1960 presidential election because we've talked about the Kennedy administration with the origins of the Cold War and with the Civil Rights Movement. But I want to take a step back and look more closely at this political moment. Richard Nixon was the Republican candidate in the election, and he was pretty well known because he had spent the previous 8 years as Eisenhower's vice president. And so within that capacity, he gained a lot of foreign policy experience. But before that, Richard Nixon was a member of Congress, and there he had earned a reputation for being an anti-communist hardliner. He was working with groups like HUAC to help root out communism within the United States. John F. Kennedy, by contrast, is much less well known in the national political theater. He's a one-term senator from Massachusetts, but Kennedy is also going to be struggling against an issue that doesn't seem like much of an issue to us today. And that is the fact that Kennedy was Roman Catholic, and many people were concerned that he was going to favor Catholic schools or parochial private schools over public schools when it came to funding. So he spent a lot of the campaign really trying to argue against that image issue. One of the other interesting things about the presidential election of 1960 is that this is the very first time we have a televised presidential debate. And what's interesting about this is that the debate was broadcast both on the radio and on television. And what's interesting is that the people who listened to the broadcast on the radio felt like Richard Nixon had won the debate. But for those who were watching on television, they felt like John Kennedy had the edge. And it really, when we dissect this moment, one of the things that we learn is that image is really important now when it comes to the age of television and politics. John Kennedy was young, he was handsome, he wore makeup during the debate to clear up his skin and make himself look presentable. The other thing is, when he was answering the questions, John Kennedy looked into the television camera. So for the viewer, it looks like he's looking right at you. Nixon, on the other hand, was recovering from an illness. He refused to wear makeup. It looked like he had a 5 o'clock shadow. And honestly, he kind of looked like death warmed over because his skin didn't look good. And when he was answering the questions, he was looking at the moderator who was off to the side, off screen. So for the viewer, it looked like Richard Nixon was ignoring them. And so this is why we see this differentiation between those who listened on the radio and those who watched it on television. When it comes down to it, this is an incredibly close election. John Kennedy wins this election by a razor-thin margin. We're talking about 118,000 votes out of 68 million that were cast. And in fact, we had a couple of states, Illinois and Florida, where there were some disputed electoral returns. But Nixon decides not to fight it, and John Kennedy wins the presidential election of 1960. With the Kennedy administration, we have elected the youngest man ever into the presidency. Now, if you're into trivia, Theodore Roosevelt was the youngest man ever to become the president with William McKinley's assassination. John Kennedy was the youngest person ever elected to the presidency. And so here you have this young, handsome, wealthy man, his beautiful wife, Jacqueline, and Kennedy surrounded himself with the brightest men of his generation. So these are not Eisenhower's generation. This is not the old guard. These are young men with fresh ideas. And so it gives us this sense of mythology to the Kennedy administration. In fact, some people referred to the Kennedy administration as Camelot. This is the reference to the legendary court of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. And Kennedy emphasizes this within his famous inaugural speech, where he calls upon the youth of America to contribute to the efforts and the development of the nation. You know, the famous line, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." But Kennedy is also going to be using his inaugural speech to call attention to his own sort of staunch anti-communism. Because remember, he doesn't have a lot of political experience, and a lot of people thought of him as a political lightweight. President Kennedy is going to call his domestic program the New Frontier, which emphasizes his belief that Americans have always been adventurers. They were eager to conquer and to exploit new frontiers. And so he's displaying his energy and optimistic outlook for America's future, which brings us to an interesting moment here. There's a disconnect between the way that historians talk about the Kennedy administration and the place of the Kennedy administration in America's collective memory. When historians judge the effectiveness of the Kennedy administration, he doesn't score very well. And the reason is because Kennedy won the 1960 presidential election by a razor-thin margin, which meant he didn't have a mandate for moving his program forward. And so even within his own political party, he's going to face a lot of opposition, particularly from conservative Southern Democrats who had joined with Republicans to oppose his efforts to increase federal aid to education or to welfare programs. So when we boil it down, Kennedy promises a lot, but yet doesn't accomplish much. And so that ineffectiveness moves him down the list of great American presidents from the perspective of historians. Now, the American public somehow always names John Kennedy in the top 10 greatest U.S. presidents. We'll talk a little bit more on that in just a moment. But one of the legacies connected with this idea of hope and promise has to do with the Peace Corps. This was a program where the U.S. government is sending college graduates to developing countries in order to assist with building their education programs, helping out with technical and technological issues, and building up their infrastructure. So this was a way of presenting America's best and brightest young people, helping to make the world a better place. Part of the reason why the American public ranks John Kennedy much higher than historians do is because of his assassination. The man died young and violently, and that sort of builds a sense of emotional attachment to Kennedy as a man, as the president. So, short version of this story, on November 22nd, 1963, John Kennedy, his wife, the Vice President Lyndon Johnson, and his wife Lady Bird were all in Dallas, Texas, doing a little early campaigning. And the reason they're in Texas is because the Vice President, Lyndon Johnson, is from Texas. So the idea is you start to build on some friendly crowds and, build some momentum into the 1964 presidential election. But Kennedy is assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald, and he's kind of got an interesting backstory. This guy's about 24 years old. He's an ex-Marine. He had tried to defect to the Soviet Union. He claimed to have secret information, but it turns out he didn't. And so the Soviet Union rejected him, and he comes back to the United States, and he really just wants to make an impact. He wants to show the Soviet Union that he's serious, and so he assassinates the president. Jack Ruby is captured But before any sort of trial or any sort of investigation can really take place, Lee Harvey Oswald himself is assassinated by Jack Ruby. This guy's super sketchy. I mean, this guy is a Dallas nightclub owner. He has connections to the mafia, and he just happens to be dying of cancer. So he's not going to live much longer beyond serving his time. In fact, Jack Ruby would die in prison. And I mean, all of this is going to spark some major conspiracy theories. These are super fun. But when he was asked, why did you kill Lee Harvey Oswald before we could learn anything about it? And Jack Ruby's response was, I was distraught. I wanted to kill the man who killed the president. And so, like I said, because of this, we have these numerous conspiracy theories about who might have been involved. Was it the Soviets? Was it the Cubans? Maybe it was the mafia. Maybe it was aliens. Who knows? Because there were so many questions about the Kennedy assassination, President Lyndon Johnson is going to set up a commission to investigate what exactly happened with the Kennedy assassination. And so the man pictured here is the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Earl Warren. So he heads up this commission. They interview witnesses, they collect evidence, and they come to the conclusion that Lee Harvey Oswald killed President Kennedy and that he acted alone. There was no conspiracy, but we don't exactly know what his motives were. And then the second part of this is that Jack Ruby acted alone, that there was no conspiracy involved. What has helped to build the conspiracy theories is the fact that many of the records surrounding the Kennedy assassination have been sealed and housed within the National Archives. But the final segments of the records were declassified in October of 2017, and we didn't learn anything new. But yet the conspiracies continue. So coming back to our question to think about here, how does the Kennedy administration embody the spirit of the hope and promise of the early 1960s? Here you have this young, handsome, vibrant man, his beautiful wife, and his young, fresh-minded advisors sort of projecting this image of Camelot. And with Kennedy's speeches, you get the feeling that the potential of the United States is limitless, that America can accomplish anything that we put our minds to. Now, as we get into the story further in the 1960s, we're going to see a marked movement away from that sense of hope and promise. So stay tuned for part 2 of the 60s and Vietnam.